Hi everyone, I'm Kennan from Cars and Bids, and today we're talking about the finer, more subtle details of a very unsubtle car. Recently, I helped Doug prepare his gorgeous Lamborghini Countach for the illustrious La Jolla Concours d'Elegance, and we actually won an award there for this car's originality. In the time preparing this car, I spent many hours going over all the fine details of the Countach, and I noticed some really cool, unusual things that, well, you might not notice if you see one of these cars because you're struck by the pure awe of it because, well, it's a Countach. So in today's video, I wanted to share some of the finer details of the Countach with you. And with that, let's get started. The first thing I would like to talk about with this car would be its relationship with curves. Now that might sound a little bit unusual because the Countach is known for being a wedge, and that's because the windshield and the front hood, well, they are on the same plane. It looks like a wedge. However, this car actually has a lot of very subtle curves, and one of my favorites is the body line that runs down the length of the Countach. It starts right up here at the front, and it gently curves over the front wheels before dipping down in the middle and then gently curving again over the rear wheels. It looks like a pen had drawn that line very simply, and that's of course because it did. Marcello Gandini incorporated that little curve into this wedge shape, and I think it actually makes it look, well, very nice and, well, kind of round compared to the normal wedge that this car is known for. This particular Countach is also known as a round belly. Later cars would get these side straight panels that would run down the rockers, but the earlier cars, more similar to this one, both the high and the low body Countaches got a round shape to them. It's so round, in fact, that it's actually relatively difficult to clean all the way underneath it. It's incredibly round. And the door of this car also curves away underneath the car, just one nice continuous curve. Again, something you might not expect on a car that's known for being a wedge. The next quasi-curve I want to talk about would be the wheel arches of the Countach, specifically focusing at the rear, as they're not quite round but not quite angular. They're this really unusual shape. It's important to remember that when Marcello Gandini penned this car and worked on all of the early Lamborghinis, he had really nothing to go on, a totally blank sheet of paper. Unlike Ferrari and Maserati, which had a storied design language already, Lamborghini was brand new, and so he could basically do whatever he wanted. And one of the things he wanted to introduce with this radical, insane car would be these, well, relatively unusual wheel arches. And there's something that is carried on in Lamborghini history. The Lamborghini Murcielago shares this sort of design language, as does the Aventador. Its rear wheel arches look relatively similar to these, and even the Lamborghini Urus, the SUV, uses a very similar wheel arch design, all tying in to the Lamborghini heritage that started with this car. The wheel arches are kind of poetic for this car in that they're both round and angular, as again, well, this car is kind of a weird blend of both of those design elements. The last curve-related thing I want to talk about with this car would be found at the front. Now, of course, like I mentioned, it's not the windshield and it's not the hood. Both of those are extremely flat and extremely angular. In fact, if you stand at this point of the Countach and lean down a little bit, you can still see the headlight all the way at that end because it's one flat plane. But something that's not so flat would be the fenders that are found on this car. They very gently curve out this way, a very subtle and gentle curve from the otherwise flat plane. It's not totally flat all the way across, they rise up a little bit here, and they transition gently into the door and into this body line. Again, this is something that's relatively subtle, but it's a curve that's found here on the front of the very flat and very angular Countach. Staying at the front of this car, I wanted to talk about what the various holes do in the front of this bumper, as I've always been curious as I haven't really spent too much time around a Countach. The black ones located here at the bottom of the front bumper are brake ducts. They channel air to the brakes in order to keep them cool during high-performance driving situations. These grills, on the other hand, perplexed me a little bit more, as the radiators for this car are famously mounted at the back, where the engine is. So what do these do? They allow air to flow into the air conditioning and climate control system for this car in order to cool things down. When you open this front compartment, you can see that they flow directly into those, and, well, that makes a whole lot of sense. However, you can also see daylight when you look at these particular parts of the car, meaning that if Doug ever drives this thing in the rain, well, I suspect it's going to make a mess of anything that's located in the front of this car, and I'll have more work to do. Another pedantic detail found at the front of this car has to do with the emblem. When I was cleaning this for the first time, I noticed that there were these two divots. It looked like it had gotten damaged somehow at some point, and I thought, oh no, I'm going to have to figure out a way to remedy this. But instead, they're actually two posts that go through the entire emblem, through the hood, and are riveted on the other side. That's how Lamborghini affixed this thing to the hood. Instead of hiding it on the back plate of this emblem, they decided, nah, we're just going to go through the whole thing and you're going to have to look at it. Kind of a weird lack of attention to detail, but that's how Lamborghini got this thing stuck to the hood of the Countach. Opening the famed scissor doors and moving inside the Countach, there are a couple of really neat details that I found inside this thing as I was getting it ready, and one has to do with the air vents. Located at the very front of the dashboard of this car, there are 3 air vents that face the occupants, and each of them has a Lamborghini rampaging bull on them. Now, a lot of the switchgear in this car comes right out of the Fiat parts bin of that time, but not these. These were specific to Lamborghini as evidenced by those bulls. Now, me being me, of course, I made sure they were all perfectly straight and all nice and clean for the judges of this car, but I thought it was a really cool piece of attention to detail that Lamborghini put into this car at the time. The next thing I noticed has to do with safety, which is not really what you think of when you think of a Lamborghini Countach. Located to the left of the steering wheel, you'll notice a little tiny light that has a seatbelt on it. I believe that is the seatbelt warning for this car, making sure that, well, you have your seatbelt fastened so you don't drive off with it unbuckled. Now, granted, when you're driving this car, it's completely obscured by the steering wheel and the dash binnacle itself. You can't really see it when you're in your normal driving position, but kind of an unusual safety feature found in a car that otherwise wouldn't be associated with something as mundane and boring as safety. When you're sitting in an Italian exotic car, one of the things you notice is just how much of it is covered in leather. And of course, the Countach is that way. The steering wheel, the seats, the dash binnacle, this thing you slide over when you get in, all of that is covered in leather. But what struck me more is how much of this car is carpeting. Of course, you expect the footwells to be covered in carpet. What you don't expect is that it extends outside of the footwell and then goes up almost onto the dash. This whole part that's located sort of where your leg would be in the footwell, well, that's all carpet all the way up to the dashboard. Kind of weird that Lamborghini took it up all that far and didn't, create another panel to cover some of this in leather. Behind the seats is also covered in carpet, almost all the way up the firewall. Now, I don't know if it was optional to have that done in leather and it's just not done on this particular car, but with this one, it's done in carpeting. So this car is a blend of metal and leather like you expect, but also a lot of carpeting. The last thing I want to discuss in here would be the scissor doors. Now, they have these pockets that are located on each one, and they, of course, house the handle to get in and out of this car. Then they look like they would be able to hold some stuff, but then you realize, of course, the door goes up when you open it, so you couldn't actually put anything in there. I think Lamborghini almost wanted to give the illusion of some level of practicality by including these, and they give you something large to hold on to when you go to slam these doors closed, as you have to close them pretty hard. But I thought that it was unusual that they made these pockets look like you could actually put stuff in there, but in reality, well, of course, you can't. Another cool and kind of subtle detail with the Countach has to do with some of the air ducting located at the rear of this car. I'm not talking about these giant air boxes that are kind of stuck onto the rear design of this car. Those aren't so subtle. What I'm talking about has to do with the fins that are located in front of them. This car has metal fins that are located to direct air into the radiators of this car to provide more direct airflow and keep things nice and neat and clean. In this car's case, they're actually slightly narrower at the top and they fan out slightly at the bottom, giving this kind of gentle flow to them. It looks really nice. They're also slightly lipped at the back to help channel airflow directly where Lamborghini wanted to with the radiators in this car. And I think it's one of the more subtle and more elegant design features, as well. I'm sure this was not easy for Lamborghini to get right. And now we move to the last thing I want to discuss with the Countach, and it's found in the engine bay. And no, it's not the glorious, naturally aspirated and carbureted in this case V12. Normally in this part of the video, I would get into the nerdy technical details of this engine, but I'm going to save that for another time. What I'm going to focus on is the weird oil filter situation we have directly in front of me. This huge metal apparatus is the oil filter housing for this car, and it truly is gigantic, larger than like a normal water bottle, and you can't miss it. It's on proud display right here. What strikes me as odd, in addition to its size, is how Lamborghini routed the oil lines for this, as one of them goes directly over the air intake for this side of the engine. Now, the problem with that is that the hot engine oil passing through that line will eventually cause heat soak as it radiates heat down onto this part of the intake, meaning that this side of the engine will run less efficiently than that side of the engine will. This is a bizarre piece of detail with this car, and I'm sure it doesn't help with the performance at all, but then again, this car was all form first and function second. And those are some of the finer details that often go overlooked with the Lamborghini Countach. I personally feel that you can't really get to know a car until you've cleaned it, until you've gone over it with your own hands, as a lot of details that would otherwise go overlooked will pop out to you. And while I admit this isn't my normal type of video, since all of these things are fresh in my mind, well, I figured I wanted to share them with you, as a lot of people don't get to be this close to a Lamborghini Countach. And if you've been in the market for a Lamborghini, well, you can check out our wide selection, of course, on Cars and Bids. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will talk to you very soon. Goodbye.